A rally of the Na Party. 15 years after Germany's defeat in the Great War, a Nazi government had come to power. A government dedicated to making Germany great again. A government led by Adolf Hitler.
Und ihr müsst euch in den Gehorsam üben. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk ein friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
Hitler was a brilliant, magnetic speaker who created an atmosphere of excitement and violence and power. The Germans responded to him.
Deshalb friedfertig sein und mutig zugleich.
But at first, Hitler was not taken very seriously in Britain. He was seen as an unpleasant figure, but rather a ridiculous one. Someone to be laughed at, not feared. But Hitler soon changed all that. He built up the strongest armed forces in Europe, and soon they were on the march. In 1936, they occupied the Rhineland, on Germany's frontier with France. In March 1938, Austria. 6 months later, they threatened Czechoslovakia. How would Britain meet this challenge? Mr. Chamberlain, Britain's Prime Minister from 1937, did not want war, and he thought the only way to avoid it was to come to an agreement with Hitler. In September 1938, he came back from a conference in Munich where he'd signed an agreement accepting a German takeover of large parts of Czechoslovakia. When he landed at Hendon, bearing a friendly statement signed by Hitler, people cheered him as a peacemaker.
You may sleep quietly. It is peace for our time.
To many British people, the thought of war was a nightmare. They believed that it would be even more terrible than the Great War. They believed that as soon as war broke out, high explosives and poisoned gas would rain down on their defenseless cities. They seemed to want peace at any price, but it was a false hope. In 1939, Hitler struck at Poland, and this time Britain did not stand aside. She declared war on Hitler.
It's odd, but I remember very clearly the first day of the war. Well, maybe it isn't odd because it was a very special sort of day in the lifetime of my generation. We'd heard the Prime Minister telling us that we were now in a state of war with Germany, and came out of that feeling, well, this is it, and all the things that we've known were going to happen to us, or they thought were going to happen to us, were going to happen. And quite soon after he talked, the siren went, and everybody rushed out and told people to get to the park, to get to their posts, and I was going to be an air raid warden, and all the wardens came round and said, what shall we do? Because there was nothing to do, because nothing happened at all.
There was no panic. In fact, this particular alarm turned out to be a false one, and there was a sense of anticlimax. This was to be typical of the first few months of the war, the phony war, as people called it. Children and many mothers from the cities were evacuated to the country in thousands because of the threat of air raids. For some, it was to be the first time they'd ever been to the country. But a good many of them were to return before long, since the expected reign of death did not take place. It all had a slightly unreal air, and there was little of the warlike spirit of 1914.
Hitler will send no warning, so always carry your gas mask.
Grow your own food.
Women required for motor driving and telephonist duties.
Mr. Chamberlain, who'd tried so desperately to prevent the war, hoped against hope that fighting wouldn't be necessary at all. But over the months, many people began to feel that if they were at war, they ought to be getting on with it, and there was a demand for stronger leadership. In May 1940, Chamberlain was replaced by a much tougher figure, Winston Churchill. Churchill had always favoured a firm line against Nazi Germany. In the 30s, he'd not been particularly popular with working people, but now the nation was with him. And as he took office, Hitler's armies struck. On May the 10th, the German forces smashed into Holland, Belgium and France in a lightning attack. The phony war was over. Within 6 weeks, the Germans had taken Paris. Hitler had wiped out the defeat of 1918 with a vengeance. The British Army was nearly cut off and hurriedly evacuated from Dunkirk on the Channel coast. But in a curious way, the blackness of Britain's situation appealed to the British people. They seemed to enjoy being on their own against Hitler, and even if he was planning to invade England, they weren't particularly worried.
The day that we heard the news of Dunkirk, I was with friends. I wasn't in my own home. I had to go home because my husband, if he could, was going to phone from Portsmouth. And he did phone. He said, "Don't worry, we always lose every battle except the last one. We'll win, we'll beat them." And then he said, "Now, if we should be invaded, and there could be, as we're the only ones now, this is what I want you to do. There's all sorts of things in the car which I put in when I was on leave. And I want you to take the car and get down to the boat." We had a boat down on the Blackwater. "Don't go on the main roads, go side roads. Take someone with you, keep the doors of the car locked, and there's a policeman's baton there to beat off." And I listened to this, and it was sort of something that couldn't be happening. But anyway, I listened. He was quite serious, of course. And then I said, "No, I won't go. I won't be driven out of my home by Germans. I'm staying."
In August 1940, invasion became a real possibility as Hitler launched air attacks on the British ports and airfields. But Churchill expressed a relentless British determination to survive.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
For 4 weeks, over Kent and Surrey, there was a desperate battle in the skies. If the Germans had destroyed the Royal Air Force, Britain might have been invaded for the first time since 1066. But the German losses were too heavy. The invasion had to be called off. So Hitler began to turn his bombers on British cities in an attempt to destroy the morale of the people. Every night in London, the people crowded down into the underground stations in their thousands. it was about the only place they could feel really safe. Many of them wondered whether there'd be a home to go back to in the morning.
OP control, 36 OP. Incendiary bombs falling between 145 degrees and 180 degrees, about 3/4 of a mile. Thank you.
34 anti-aircraft.
Control. Right. Fire at Dock Street, sub.
Right.
It was a strange experience to look out after a bad night of raids. A few more hundred people would be dead. Hundreds more would have lost their homes. But the effect of the Blitz was the opposite of what Hitler intended. Little lasting damage was done to transport or industrial production, and far from damaging people's morale or breaking their spirit, the experience of the raids seemed to make them more cheerful and more determined. A new slogan was coined: Britain can take it.
Calling workers.
This sense of common purpose was also seen in industry. People felt they were helping to defeat Hitler, and there were comparatively few strikes. Here, too, there was a cheerful sense of common purpose.
Music value work of the day to you this morning on Rhythmic Records.
On the whole, working people were better off than before. Wages had risen, and the government was pretty successful in holding down prices. And of course, there was plenty of work. As in the Great War, there was a big demand for their labor, in the factories or on the land. Agriculture was particularly vital, because food supplies were greatly reduced by the German blockade. Food was rationed. You got 2 ounces of butter a week and less than a pound of meat. Clothing too was rationed, and petrol, and fuel, and many other things. In a great many ways, life was much more tightly regulated by the state than ever before. But the rationing and the regulations were felt to be fair, and everyone was in the same boat. In spite of inconvenience and danger, people were happy and their spirits were high. Indeed, Britain was a much more cheerful place to live in than it had been in the 30s. Another change was a new interest in the arts. Galleries and theatres were well attended. Serious books were quickly sold, and concerts like those given by Myra Hess at the National Gallery were packed. People seemed to want to live life to the full while they had the chance. Meanwhile, from 1942 on, increasingly heavy fleets of British and American bombers pounded the German cities. They did very much greater damage than ever the Germans had done to Britain. And in June 1944, British and Allied forces landed in France to carry the war towards Germany. There was hard, bloody fighting, but the casualties were much less than in the Great War, and it was fighting to some purpose. On May the 8th, 1945, the news came of Germany's surrender, and cheering crowds greeted Churchill in Whitehall. But the people spent little time rejoicing in the victory. To his surprise, Winston Churchill was soon to be dismissed from power at a general election in favour of the quiet, unspectacular Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party. The British people had had enough of heroics. They were more interested in conditions at home. 3 months later, when the war in the East was finally over, the British got, thankfully, out of uniform. They weren't particularly interested in glory or power or Britain's position in the world. They certainly didn't want to go on soldiering. They wanted to turn their backs on the war and all it stood for, and get back to ordinary, peaceful life in a Britain they hoped would be better than the Britain of the 1930s. Had a long way to go. On May the 8th, 1945, the news came of Germany's surrender, and cheering crowds greeted Churchill in Whitehall. But the people spent little time rejoicing in the victory. To his surprise, Winston Churchill was soon to be dismissed from power at a general election in favour of the quiet, unspectacular Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party. The British people had had enough of heroics. They were more interested in 3 months later, when the war in the East was finally over, the British got, thankfully, out of uniform. They weren't particularly interested in glory or power or Britain's position in the world. They certainly didn't want to go on soldiering. They wanted to turn their backs on the war and all it stood for. Get back to ordinary, peaceful life in a Britain they hoped would be better than the Britain of the 1930s.